There go the people. I must follow them, for I am their leader. That sarcastic quote, attributed to 19th century French politician Alexandre Ledru-Rollin, is as relevant to politics today as it was back then, and has particular relevance to the question of how deficit-focused politics rose and fell in the United States. Back in 2010, the national debt was becoming the issue that could make or break political careers in Washington, especially on the right. The Tea Party movement had just emerged as a factor to be reckoned with, and Republicans made it the centerpiece of their opposition strategy, riding it into battle in the 2012 presidential election. The fallout from losing that year, combined with the rise of Donald Trump in 2016, who broke with long-standing Republican orthodoxy on many issues, led to one of the most remarkable political U-turns in recent memory. By the time he left office after his first term, deficit politics that had dominated the early part of the decade were just a distant memory. The debt has continued to climb throughout all of this, and in recent months has begun to re-enter public discourse after a years-long absence. So what changed? How did something that seemed so central to American politics just a few years earlier become basically an afterthought? Well, today is that story. By fall of 2008, the American economy had officially entered a meltdown severe enough to warrant a government intervention on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. One such measure, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, passed with a record-setting price tag of $700 billion, a figure so enormous that it required multiple congressional votes and a rare bipartisan coalition buy-in to succeed. By the time that President Obama took office the following January, he wasted little time in pushing for another rescue package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, this time with an additional $787 billion in an attempt to prevent the economic downturn from spiraling into something more akin to a depression. Fiscal year 2009, which included both rescue packages, closed out with a federal deficit of $1.4 trillion, crossing into trillion-dollar territory for the first time in American history. Most economists argued that these emergency measures were necessary to prevent complete economic collapse. With the benefit of hindsight, they were largely right. The fallout from a total meltdown of the nation's financial sector would have been felt for years or potentially even decades to come, with deep impact to the average citizen. And yet, for millions of Americans watching their retirement accounts evaporate and their home values crater, seeing their tax dollars simultaneously flow to rescue the very banks and financial institutions that had caused the crisis in the first place, well, it wasn't exactly well received, to put it that way. The anger in response to the crisis and its handling in Washington was expressed both by the left and the right, albeit with different critiques. Progressives and populist left-wing voices railed against corporate welfare and rewarding bad behavior from the country's richest institutions, eventually spinning into the Occupy Wall Street movement. The right, for their part, were eager to join in. Some were opposed to the TARP measures originally and focused on the moral hazard side of the equation, essentially expressing concern that for free markets to work, risk-taking that results in losses shouldn't be protected from failing, and applied it to both the corporate side of things as well as the individual side of the equation. Others focused on the mortgage rescue scheme of the Obama administration, aimed at minimizing foreclosures. The right's anger really took off on February 19, 2009, when CNBC correspondent Rick Santelli stood on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and delivered what has since been dubbed the rant heard around the world. Surrounded by traders, Santelli stood back and asked, "How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills?" In response to a chorus of boos, he added,
"President Obama, are you listening?"
He proposed organizing a Chicago Tea Party on live television to protest the moral hazard of rewarding what he described as reckless behavior. The clip went viral, a new phenomenon in 2009, and within days, groups across the country calling themselves the Tea Party began organizing. This wasn't just a group of fringe people either, it was a threat to the Republican establishment in a way that many didn't recognize at the time. The new populist movement seemed willing to actually follow through on decades of fiscally conservative rhetoric that had never really been implemented during GOP presidencies or control of Congress. While cuts have been enacted periodically to certain programs, spending nevertheless maintained a relatively consistent upward trajectory. Much to the party establishment's dismay, the Tea Party increasingly seemed to be a force that would have to be reckoned with, rather than something that would fizzle out after a few news cycles. By that summer, activists were packing town hall meetings across the country, confronting congressmen over why Washington kept spending money that it didn't have. Conservative outlets leaned into this hard. Fox News gave the issue prominent coverage and even began displaying a national debt clock to serve viewers with a reminder of the approaching fiscal catastrophe. Other right-wing activists championed the issue themselves, ranging from Glenn Beck to Rush Limbaugh on their respective shows, which reached enormous audiences. Whether the resulting anger represented genuine organic grassroots fury throughout the country from the bottom up or a top-down cycle of intimidation and radicalization, well, that remains a question that's still debated today and will likely be debated for years to come. Regardless of how it developed, though, it very much was real and could only be ignored at politicians' own peril. The movement proved it could deliver on more than just holding rallies and talks in 2010 when a Republican, Scott Brown, won a special election for longtime Senator Ted Kennedy's seat in Massachusetts, a seat held by Democrats for nearly 50 years. Brown ran explicitly against both Obama's spending agenda as well as healthcare reform proposals, which itself was deeply connected to spending concerns. Then the 2010 midterms, 9 months later, confirmed the trend. Republicans gained 63 House seats that year, the largest swing since 1938, with many victories coming from political newcomers running explicitly on Tea Party platforms of slashing spending and eliminating the deficit. This freshman class arrived in January 2011 and wasted little time in finding a leverage point to attempt to force through reform. Every few years, Congress has to vote to raise the debt ceiling, a unique aspect of American politics that limits the amount the government is allowed to borrow, which not only impacts future spending, but also financing money that has already been spent. Historically, this has been a routine measure, sometimes contentious, but the country was never at risk of defaulting on its debt. Until then, that is. The new Tea Party Republicans saw this as the perfect chance to force spending cuts. They didn't have the votes to pass legislation themselves, nor did they have the numbers to block a floor vote. They did have the precedent of something known as the Hastert rule, though, in which the Speaker had the long-standing expectation of not bringing bills to the floor without the support of the majority of his or her party. This gave them an informal veto over raising the debt ceiling and forced negotiations between Republican Speaker John Boehner and President Obama over the months to come. The grand bargain proposal that resulted would have combined spending cuts with tax increases, an approach that would have delivered on concerns of both parties but ultimately alienated the bases in each. Republicans ultimately drew a red line against any tax increases, and Democrats refused entitlement cuts without new revenue sources, collapsing negotiations. As the deadline approached with no deal in sight, the deficit hawks were pursuing a maximalist approach that would test just how much their voters had bought into this narrative. Standard & Poor's threatened to downgrade America's AAA credit rating for the first time in history, a shocking warning given how rock-solid US debt had been for decades. Nevertheless, default was a real possibility, not because the country couldn't pay its bills, but because Congress just wouldn't let it. The breakthrough came from the results of a rather unusual coalition between Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Vice President Joe Biden. The Budget Control Act, as it was called, gave conservatives enough of what they wanted to bring them on board: no tax increases, immediate spending caps, and an automatic mechanism to slash spending if a to-be-established supercommittee failed to identify additional reductions. Altogether, the package promised no less than $2.1 trillion in debt reductions over a decade. Boehner pushed hard on his caucus and was able to get a majority of his party on board to bring the bill to the floor without violating the Hastert rule. When the vote came, it sailed through with 174 Republicans and 95 Democrats voting in favor. Markets breathed a sigh of relief, as did many throughout the country who were worried about a real default. But many in the Tea Party were furious, claiming that the deal hadn't gone far enough and recognized that this had been a rare moment where they held real power that was unlikely to repeat itself anytime soon. They focused much of this anger onto Boehner himself, casting him as a sellout and a squish, a theme that would only accelerate in the years to come. Critically, however, they also lumped in the Republicans who backed the bill, characterizing them as being too establishment to actually fight for what they believed was needed. The debt ceiling crisis had forced a shutdown, successfully extracted spending, and yet left the Tea Party feeling betrayed. This tension began to define Republicans, especially with the upcoming presidential primary looming. If 2011 proved the Tea Party could extract concessions through brinkmanship, 2012 would test whether deficit politics could actually win a presidential election. The Republican primary field that emerged reflected just how thoroughly deficit politics had taken over the party. While other issues ranging from national defense to social issues like abortion were significant, the issues of spending, particularly in relation to healthcare following the passage of the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, dominated. Now, to their credit, Many of the candidates were not delusional in thinking that such messaging could be effective at winning. The Republicans were coming off a very successful midterm election, going up against an incumbent president, and they believed that they could carry the energy from 2010 into 2012. Mitt Romney ultimately secured the Republican nomination after a contentious primary against a relatively crowded field of opponents, the majority of whom ran to his right. Romney campaigned on a platform of self-described fiscal responsibility and promised real spending cuts and deficit reduction while also distancing himself from the more overtly populist wing of the party. He recognized that to win a general election, he couldn't lean fully into the more extreme approaches that some in his party's base may have preferred him to take. Unlike several of his opponents, his spending cuts lacked calls for the wholesale elimination of cabinet departments, for instance. Romney represented a combination of achieving conservative fiscal goals through purported competent management rather than revolutionary change. The problem is that this left many Tea Party activists out in the cold. In particular, his record as a former governor of Massachusetts, where he was comparatively much more moderate than as a presidential candidate, made him look inauthentic to many. Romney recognized this early on, but some of his remarks that attempted to reconcile this only backfired. Statements like describing himself as severely conservative sounded more like a medical diagnosis than genuine political identification. His choice of Paul Ryan as his vice presidential candidate helped to energize the base. Ryan had long been a rock star of the right, seen as a reliable voice on tackling spending through carefully crafted budgets. Conservative voices in outlets like the Wall Street Journal's editorial section and National Review dubbed him the intellectual leader of the Republican Party for a reason. He represented something rather unique in Washington, someone who'd put detailed plans down on paper showing how he would get something done rather than make vague platitudes about fiscal responsibility. Polling throughout election year suggested that the deficit message was resonating. Surveys showed that roughly 70% of Americans called the deficit a major problem requiring immediate action, and it consistently ranked among voters' top concerns. As November approached, it became clear that this election was going to represent the culmination of everything the deficit hawks had been building towards since that CNBC moment back in 2009. This was their moment, and they had to deliver. Except, well, Romney lost. It wasn't a landslide in the popular vote, losing 47% to Obama's 51%, but he got clobbered on the electoral map, losing the entirety of the Rust Belt states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Obama carried every single swing state, save for North Carolina. In the immediate aftermath of the election, there was a lot of soul-searching in the GOP in terms of what went wrong and how they should move forward. Perhaps most infamously was the so-called post-mortem report from the Republican National Committee, which called for the party to soften its stance on immigration to better attract Latino voters. Some blamed Romney himself, arguing that he was too wooden in his approach to issues, and that came off as inauthentic. Others still presented the damning ads that ran against Ryan's budget plans, one of which made waves after a Ryan lookalike threw a grandma in a wheelchair off a cliff representing the alleged impact of his Medicare cuts.
Well, liberals are pushing Granny and your generation off a cliff.
There's probably truth to all of these to some extent, but the latter seems to carry far more weight. That advertisement had captivated Americans, concerning them about what would happen to benefits that they cared deeply about, even if it was exaggerated. The psychology behind this was relatively basic, but nevertheless influential in terms of voter preference. People aren't exactly inclined to vote against their own benefits. When politicians are proposing cutting Medicare or raising the retirement age, particularly in healthy economies with no imminent threat of collapse, voters see the trade-off with only a very abstract long-term gain in exchange for a really real short-term loss. Their voting preference in response to that shouldn't exactly be shocking. The years following Romney's defeat didn't bring much moderation. Many Tea Party Republicans were quick to disown their party's last candidate as a phony and arrived at the conclusion that their approach just hadn't been aggressive enough. John Boehner had come under unceasing fire since the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, and by 2015 he'd reached a point where he could no longer carry on as leader. The newly established Freedom Caucus, a group founded by the most hardline Tea Party members, had made it their mission to make his life difficult, and at least on that front, they were absolutely successful. Ryan himself assumed the role of Speaker in late 2015, though he did so reluctantly, knowing all too well how difficult it was to manage the divided House Republican caucus. The party's presidential primary was already well underway by this point, which only further complicated matters given that Donald Trump was gaining ground at a pace that was beginning to make people think that he might actually win. It might be hard to remember a time when he didn't dominate the Republican Party, but his candidacy was initially seen as largely a joke and dismissed given his very low poll numbers. The Huffington Post rather infamously moved coverage of his campaign to their entertainment section. Steadily, though, he was climbing, in spite of all the recommendations of that post-mortem report. Among the principles at risk was the fiscal conservatism that had come to define the party. Several candidates leaned hard into the fiscal conservatism play, but Trump largely pursued his own path. He promised simultaneously to eliminate the national debt, increase military spending, and protect Medicare and Social Security from cuts. Now, while we can certainly point out that this trifecta didn't exactly materialize as promised, his strategy here was nevertheless telling. Without entirely doing away with the old-school concern about the nation's deficit, he nevertheless recognized that hyper-focusing on it was clearly off-putting to many voters, especially when it came to cuts to programs like Medicare. The shift was gradual. He wasn't endorsing massive increases to the debt, but he wasn't exactly proposing the massive slashes in spending either. The Republican primary voters who had spent years demanding fiscal discipline ultimately chose Trump over the candidates offering detailed spending plans, which does call into question just how widespread the actual appetite for such proposals ever was. The general election that followed had considerably less focus on the debt issue than 2012's, a true indication that its prominence was on the slide. Much of the campaign dealt with immigration and the two candidates' own histories, from Trump's extremely long history of controversial comments and sordid allegations to Hillary's own controversies, emails first and foremost among them. But, well, that's an episode for another day. Trump's victory that fall, combined with the party keeping control of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, gave them unified power of government for the first time since 2007. The question, then, was what they were going to do with it. The answer came quickly. In December 2017, less than a year into unified control, when Republicans passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a major policy test for the new administration and Congress alike, the bill cut corporate tax rates from 35% to 21% and reduced individual rates across all income levels, with the CBO projecting it would add $1.9 trillion to the deficit over a decade. Republicans weren't abandoning their fiscal principles so much as betting on a different mechanism. They genuinely believed that lower rates would unleash enough economic growth which would offset the revenue loss. Whether that faith in the phenomenon known as the Laffer curve was justified remains contested among economists, with federal revenue rising in nominal terms, but the debate unlikely to ever be settled definitively. The spending side proved far more difficult to square with any coherent ideology. In 2018 and 2019, Congress passed two massive budget deals that raised spending caps by a combined $616 billion, nearly as large a price tag as the enormously controversial TARP bailout back in 2008. But this one passed with comparatively little fanfare. Both of these, crucially, came after brief government shutdowns in which it became clear that the only way to reach agreement was to essentially bypass deficit concerns entirely and simply give both parties at least some of the spending in areas they wanted. The ease with which the party abandoned these limits was also enabled by something that deficit hawks began to have an increasingly difficult time explaining to the electorate. Many of their catastrophic predictions hadn't come true. While many of the more serious candidates in the earlier part of the decade had limited their focus to how this would impact the country in the future, they were, by this point, running on a decade of panic in an otherwise expanding, relatively healthy economy. The Greek-style debt crisis, bond market revolts, and Chinese creditor calling American loans never materialized, and they still haven't. And this isn't to say that the national debt isn't an issue or couldn't become something of a crisis later on. I mean, both could materialize. The US at the time of writing has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio since World War II, and this has been rung up during a peacetime, expanding economy. That said, as is so often the case in politics, perception can very much become reality, and the perception, rightly or wrongly, became that everyone was fine. The most telling moment came when Mick Mulvaney, who'd co-founded the House Freedom Caucus and built his entire political identity around deficit hawkery, became Trump's budget director and then acting chief of staff. In 2020, he admitted what had become obvious. My party is very interested in deficits when there is a Democrat in the White House. The worst thing in the whole world is deficits when Barack Obama was president. Then Donald Trump became president, and we're a lot less interested as a party. All this aside, we do have to point out that Democrats haven't exactly missed opportunities for point scoring on the national deficit while in opposition either. While campaigning to retake the House in 2018 midterms, they criticized Republican recklessness, cutting taxes while the deficit continued to rack up. Their opposition felt rather hollow, though. They weren't proposing any spending cuts. Chuck Schumer hadn't become a deficit hawk overnight. By the end of 2019, deficit politics had achieved something remarkable. Total bipartisan abandonment, just about the only thing that the two parties could agree on. The debt kept climbing, past $22 trillion by late 2019, and Washington had made peace with that reality. What neither party anticipated was that the real test of America's willingness to borrow was still ahead. Alright, so where does that all leave us? The collapse of deficit politics as a serious political force wasn't just about Trump or partisan hypocrisy, though both played their parts. The real story runs deeper, touching on fundamental shifts in political and economic reality, as well as the very nature of how Americans relate to the immediate versus abstract fiscal threats. The simplest factor at play here is that the threats are abstract. They could present real challenges to the country, and Washington's current spending approach isn't sustainable, that's true. But we're now nearly 17 years past the infamous Centelli rant that kicked off the Tea Party, and many of their predictions simply have not come to fruition. Yet in the meantime, politics and economics has continued to march on. Throughout Obama's presidency, prominent conservatives continuously warned of imminent catastrophe. In 2010, Niall Ferguson warned in the Financial Times that the United States was on the verge of becoming Greece, and he was far from the only one. Paul Ryan's budget from 2012, we covered earlier, warned that without immediate action, a debt crisis was not a question of if, but when. By the late 2010s, even some deficit hawks were acknowledging their credibility problem. Brian Rydell of the Manhattan Institute observed that failed predictions, quote, made the anti-deficit activists look like the boy who cried wolf, while conservative columnist Ross Douthat later admitted that he'd been a participant in some of this, overestimating the urgency of the deficit problem. He hit the nail on the head there. Interest rates on debt remained extremely low. The bond vigilantes who promised to raise hell never materialized. And with Greece now running budget surpluses with an expanding economy, comparisons between Athens and Washington just aren't exactly front and center. The failure went beyond just bad predictions, though. The entire intellectual framework of deficit politics rested on assumptions that Trump's success in taking over the Republican Party exposed it as being fundamentally disconnected from the party's concerns. While there were some who were genuinely motivated by it, leading conservatives admitted that much of the hype surrounding deficits was just that, hype. Rush Limbaugh inadvertently confirmed this in July 2019 when he told his audience, nobody is a fiscal conservative anymore. All this talk about concern for the deficit and the budget has been bogus for as long as it's been around. Coming from someone who'd spent the Obama years warning about bankrupting America, this was a stunning admission that the entire crusade had just been political theater. Tucker Carlson, someone who has long represented a more populist approach to conservatism, focuses on cultural issues, representing this view perfectly, having long argued that fiscal conservatism was more of a donor class issue that never resonated with actual Republican voters. To his credit, his ratings suggest he understood the base better than the deficit hawks did. These explanations hold weight, though they can't explain the entirety of what the early 2010s saw. While it may be true that some of the dynamics that drove the focus on the deficit were top-down, the fact remains that an awful lot of Americans were genuine believers in it being a huge risk to the country. In particular, the idea that it was a donor-class view seems to leave itself open to the most criticism. Remember back in 2010, the Tea Party were the populists. They were the insurgency, coming for the establishment. And while many of their victories came initially at the expense of Democrats' seats, many more of the traditional donor-class politicians who lost their seats were Republicans who lost primary elections to Tea Party challengers. Eric Cantor, the sitting House Majority Leader from 2011 through 2014, second in command only to the Speaker, lost his primary in one such race to Dave Bratt, which was described as one of the greatest political upsets of modern times. Realistically, the answer lies somewhere between these extreme interpretations. Millions of Americans genuinely believed that the deficit posed an existential threat, but their commitment to radically slashing government spending was less resolute than many believed. In particular, the impact of year after year of doomsday-level rhetoric about the national debt that never materialized grew tiresome for many who recognized that this might not be quite such an imminent existential crisis. Trump recognized this, and he offered them something more tangible than fiscal restraint without directly disavowing it during his campaign. By the time COVID really began spreading throughout the country in late February and early March of 2020, deficit politics was so thoroughly dead and the perceived threat to the nation by the pandemic so high that Congress enacted close to $3 trillion in relief spending by late April of that year with hardly any debate. The CARES Act alone, carrying a modest price tag of $2.2 trillion, passed the Senate 96-0. The spending continued. Another $900 billion came in December 2020, followed by the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan in March 2021, though by this point the bipartisan consensus had broken, with Republicans voting against the last plan. All told, the federal government had pumped just shy of $5.8 trillion into the economy in just over a year, more than the entire 2019 federal budget. The irony is that this very spending ultimately dragged deficit politics back to the surface, though in a different form than the early Tea Party years. By 2021, inflation began to rear its ugly head after decades of being under control, ultimately peaking at 9.1% in June 2022. The Federal Reserve, after a period of long delay, eventually intervened by hiking interest rates in an effort to slow the economy and bring inflation back under control. They were largely successful in their goal, though these had serious secondary implications as well: the cost of the national debt. Remember, one of the main reasons that the country was able to essentially borrow for free was because interest on US sovereign debt was near zero for years in the aftermath of the 2008 crash. Inflation had remained low, allowing the Fed to keep interest rates historically low as well, creating a period of rather unprecedented cheap money. These interest rate hikes brought a swift end to that period. Payments on the national debt exploded to over $1 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget. We'll say that again. The United States of America is spending more on interest to service its debt than it's spending on defense. And it's America. They spend a lot on defense. And that brings us to the situation today, where concerns about the national debt are starting to surface again. One of the first big controversies of President Trump's second term surrounded the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, set up explicitly on the grounds to root out what was described as wasteful spending. It has manifested itself once again in Congress, this time with the members of the GOP taking the extremely rare step of standing up to Trump on spending over the summer during the debate over the One Big Beautiful Bill. Though it eventually passed, it took intense negotiations, with several members speaking out against its failure to cut what they believed was a sufficient amount of spending. Where this will all go is anybody's guess, but it does highlight two deeper problems in the American system as well as beyond. The first is simply how so many came to care about the issue back in the early 2010s. While there were a number of people with genuine convictions that spending was unsustainably high, and they weren't necessarily wrong for believing that, the total abdication of fiscal restraint during much of Trump's first term casts the issue as something that was less than sincere. The second, and perhaps more ominous, is that Washington settled into a half-decade-long pattern where bipartisan cooperation means both parties getting more spending in their priority areas, with the debt problem left unaddressed until crisis forces action. While we're not painting a doomsday scenario here in terms of a sudden US default, which remains extremely unlikely, we can't exactly say that Washington is on stable footing either. And given that this was written in the middle of the longest government shutdown in US history because of bipartisan gridlock, that doesn't look to change anytime soon. Thank you for watching.